Okay, so hopefully we should be live on YouTube now. I'll just give it a second or two to see that it's working. Okay, so just bear with us. We've had a few technical difficulties, but okay, hopefully, yes, it's live. So if you're watching this, you have managed to join us. So our speaker today is Dr. Kate Clancy, who is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Illinois. She's a human reproductive ecologist who specializes in women's health, endometrial function, and evolutionary medicine. Kate's research has an intersectional feminist biology approach, focusing on topics ranging from gender and racial harassment in science to the effects of environmental stressors on endometrial and ovarian dynamics. Her popular podcast series, Period Podcast, features Kate interviewing scholars and people with relevant lived experiences to share their thinking about menstruation. And the most recent episode discusses illness, stigma, and COVID. Welcome to everybody who's managed to find us on our new live stream due to some technical issues with the first one, so sorry about that. Welcome to our second Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health seminar. We're delighted to have you all with us today. So we're going to have an hour presentation, which will be followed by 30 minutes for questions. Please feel free to ask questions throughout in the chat, and you'll also find a link in the description below the video to a Google form where you can ask questions. We're very, very excited to have Kate here today and are looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So thank you very much. And Kate, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that very kind introduction. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully that all looks great. And I imagine you'll tell me if it doesn't. Okay. I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. I acknowledge these nations and others past and present and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. I also acknowledge the Native people who live and work here now. As a, quote, land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the often harmful role that this university has played in shaping them. Land acknowledgements are increasingly a way to begin to recognize the massive harms, ranging from extraction of resources to forced resettlement to genocide, that characterized colonization of the British and others across the globe. This acknowledgement is especially important in light of today's topic of menstruation science. In North America, for instance, many of the first traditions that were erased with Western colonization, where many groups either had to assimilate or be systematically murdered, were related to menstruation. What was lost, and what Native feminisms and revitalization work has sought to uncover, is that many Indigenous peoples have very different ideas about why humans menstruate than the ideas that came from colonization and later imperial white feminism. It was in starting to learn from Indigenous revitalizers, cultural anthropologists, and other scholar activists about the many ways humans have sought to understand how humans menstruate that it has become clear to me how much our scientific, quote, view from nowhere perspective, one that started by positing that menstruation is poisonous and eventually decided it was meaningless, is very much a Western one. I hope to show you how Western conceptions of why we menstruate have led to major limits on our understanding of menstruation and menstrual cycling. In fact, the alternating conceptions of uterine and ovarian function as either dangerous or meaningless have framed the way we test assumptions in our feminist biology lab. And so I'll end on 3 short vignettes to show you how we think about and do this work. In many Western contexts, there is an idea that menstrual taboos are intended to protect society from a universally ascribed feminine evil, and to therefore see menstrual taboos as tools of oppression of women. In their cross-cultural analysis of menstrual taboos, Thomas Buckley and Alma Gottlieb argue that menstrual taboos are instead multivalent, representing protection of feminine creative powers from the contamination of others or the autonomy of women. In fact, the word taboo derives from multiple indigenous Polynesian languages, from terms like tapu and taboo, and it, quote, expresses an understanding that once a thing is, it has within itself a real potency, or mana. Coupled with a potential for power is the idea of awe and sacredness, which commands respect and separateness. When Westerners learned of this concept and adopted this word, they took only the parts of the definition that were about fear of power and the creation of restriction and prohibition, misunderstanding that across these Polynesian cultures, concepts of being holy and forbidden are not separate. As Professor Manuka Hanair argues in his chapter, Tapu, Mana, Maori, Hau, Wairua, a Maori philosophy of vitalism and cosmos, all children are tapu, individuals and groups are tapu, houses and gardens are tapu, trees and birds are tapu, as are rivers, lakes, and oceans. Ecosystems and the environment as a whole are therefore tapu. Tapu needs to be treated with respect, awe, and sometimes fear, but it depends on the relationship of one's own tapu to the tapu belonging to other persons and life systems in the environment. A respectful relationship ensures balance, health, and well-being, but a bad relationship of abuse often leads to disharmony and imbalance. If we return to this original meaning of taboo then, a menstrual taboo is a recognition of the sacredness of menstruation, the power of the menstruating person, and the necessity to keep that sacredness separate to protect it. To get at what this means for how different cultures have come to understand why we menstruate, I want to share some menstrual seclusion and coming-of-age ceremonies across the globe. And so what's interesting about a lot of what Westerners in particular, those of us in sort of North American and European contexts specifically, know about is that when we think about non-Western menstrual seclusion practices, we largely know of the bad ones and the ones that in our desire to be feminist, that we see as wrong. And there are some examples of harmful or potentially harmful practices. Probably the most well-known, again in a Western context, is that of chowpatty, which is a Western Nepalese practice where menstruators are forced to sleep in these very small, crude huts. During the time that they're menstruating, they usually also have their infants and young children during these evenings. Menstruators die of exposure, snake bites, smoke inhalation because of the quality of these spaces. And there are a lot of, and some recent research has shown that there are mental health implications in terms of feelings of social isolation that also emerge because of these kinds of practices. Because these, another example is that of the Dogon of Mali, which Dr. Beverly Strassman at the University of Michigan has done a lovely job detailing in several papers. And Dr. Strassman argues that Dogon menstrual seclusion practices serve as an honest signal of cycling, and has shown that those men who practice the indigenous religion of the area, as opposed to Christianity, are actually more likely to be caring for children to whom they're genetically related, likely because of the requirement in that culture for women to tell their husbands when they're menstruating. So again, we're looking at a way of thinking about these menstrual seclusion practices as control over women, as harmful. And again, those of us who are white feminists are of course then going to jump up and say, ergo, menstrual seclusion practices are terrible and we should seek to end them. And in fact, chowpatty that I was talking about before has been criminalized. And some of these other similar seclusion practices are being pushed against by Westerners as well as folks indigenous to these areas. However, when we only promote and talk about as a way to maybe feel better about ourselves for not doing these types of seclusion practices currently in a lot of Western contexts, when we sort of prioritize these as the only face of menstrual seclusion, we actually miss a much deeper understanding of menstrual seclusion practices cross-culturally. So for instance, in Northern California, menstrual seclusion practices historically were performed in what's called a minch, a small familiar or deer house. And so when menstruating, you would be staying in this house, but it was not just for menstruators. This was also a place for postpartum women to recover and women who've had miscarriages to recover. And so these are spaces for community. These are spaces for allowing yourself to focus and remove yourself from certain types of social distractions and domestic tasks in order to sort of harness and strengthen the power of menstruation. Seclusion practices could be ended early if needed with special rituals. And as Dr. Kucha Rissling-Baldi, who is an associate professor of Native American studies and herself and herself Hoopa, she has said that, quote, menstruating women were part of the luck that men of the tribe utilized when they were hunting or needed protection. And so again, there's a much more positive framing of menstrual seclusion practices across many other environments, of which this is just one example. One other example I want to give you is that of the Beng in the Côte d'Ivoire. And so the Beng are a population that has been studied extensively by Dr. Alma Gottlieb. One of the really wonderful things about being at the University of Illinois, Dr. Gottlieb is one of my colleagues, and she's now a professor emeritus. And I now work in her old office. And so there's something very warm about sort of looking out the window and seeing the views she sees, and also, of course, knowing her and respecting her, but having these moments of realizing that parts of blood magic and parts of the work that she did were probably done in the room where I'm currently writing a book about menstruation myself. So to honor some of that work, I want to share briefly a little bit about the menstrual seclusion practices of the Beng. The menstrual taboos of the Beng are simply that a married or previously married menstruating person may not go into the forest. They may not touch a corpse. They may not touch a fire of a non-menstruating woman, and men may not eat the food prepared by someone menstruating. However, menstruating Beng are otherwise not restricted in their engagement with family, friends, and the major rituals of their community, nor are they restricted from sex or sleeping with their spouses. These taboos are intended to protect the fertile menstruating person and provide separation between the sacredness of female fertility, represented by menstruation, and earth fertility, which is considered more male and represented by the forests and fields. So it's about keeping some of these types of power separate as opposed to seeing this one as potentially evil. In fact, one of the really wonderful things about some of the restrictions to protect the power of menstruating people among the Beng is that it affords them a lot more time to cook. And so therefore, the menstruating haute cuisine is actually to take the palm nut soup that they eat so frequently in this population and actually slow cook it for many more hours than normally they have time to because of all the time they have to spend in the fields. And so this slow cooked palm nut sauce actually darkens in color to this deep, rich sort of menstrual red that you can see here. And in fact is so delicious that despite the fact that, as I've said, one of the menstrual taboos is that men should not eat the food cooked by menstruating women, many of them will steal a bite of this slow cooked palm nut sauce because it is so delicious. And young men in particular will risk this contamination of feminine power because they love this food so much. Another way to think about some of the different ways in which different populations have conceived of why we menstruate and the power of menstruation is around coming of age ceremonies. And so I want to again draw from Dr. Kucha Rissling-Baldy's work. And I forgot to mention actually that beautiful image from when I was talking about the hoopah before is actually from Dr. Baldy's mother, Lynn Rissling, who is herself both an activist, a revitalizer, and an artist. And so there was a link at the bottom where you can check out her artwork and buy it, and I encourage you to. Coming of age ceremonies, there are a lot of similarities cross-culturally of many different Indigenous coming of age ceremonies where they do often, but not always, include additional periods of seclusion. But these periods of seclusion are time for the menstruator to learn the skills and stories necessary to becoming an adult. And to be sure, in some populations, the learning how to be an adult means learning how to do the work for your husband, learning how to cook the foods that your potential husband will like, learning how to do the kinds of domestic labor that will please the people in your potential husband's family, and learning the lore of childbirth and childcare in order to, again, please your husband. So there are absolutely some coming of age ceremonies where that patriarchal notion persists. There are others, though, where that is not the rationale behind the time that is spent doing this, doing all this myth making and storytelling. So among the hoopah, again, Dr. Baldy has written of these coming of age ceremonies, both in her book, We Are Dancing for You, which I highly recommend, and is just a gorgeous love letter to Native feminism and revitalization of these coming of age ceremonies, but also just an amazing work of scholarship in many ways. And she has written of these coming of age ceremonies among the hoopah, saying, adolescent or puberty ceremonies for girls were common throughout the Indigenous Americas, but were particularly prevalent among California peoples. This dance means many things to the Native peoples of Northwest California. For the hoopah people, this dance is one of the select few done by the Kahine, the first people or spirits, for all time in the heavens above. It is only when the young girls calls the stance down from them that they stop dancing and point their sticks to where the dance is being performed. Essentially, in Hoopa culture, there's a perpetual Canaldung, or a flower dance girl, in their heavens. Menstruation is therefore powerful, healing, and sustaining. And what I'm showing you here, this image of the blue jay feather, the blue jay feathers that are before the young menstruator's eyes, are intended to focus her perspective. They're not to hide her, they're not to seclude her, but allow her to focus and harness her power. So I share these again just to highlight the fact that when we think about why we menstruate, and when we start to talk about some of the scientific origins of understanding why we menstruate, that when we broaden some of the cultural perspectives, it allows us to uncover some of the biases that maybe have been inherent in the scientific study of menstruation. So I want to turn a little bit to white/Western/colonial perspectives on menstrual taboos and menstrual storytelling. And I'm sort of saying white/Western/colonial because it kind of depends on the historical context at which we're talking, because whiteness, is a more recent construction. And so I'm sort of saying, I'm making sure to invoke all three of these to acknowledge that these are ideas that persisted and actually strengthened, and in some ways, I would say worsened over time. Especially as they were then influenced and pressed upon other peoples. So, and there's a broader conversation to be had about distinguishing between these categories. And in fact, I have a paper on that with Jenny Davis in the Annual Review of Anthropology. So if you want to think a little bit more about whiteness and Westernness and ways in which we conceive of that better within biological anthropology, I encourage you to check out that paper. Now, if we look to the Bible, for instance, as a major source of information about the historical and cultural origins of Judeo-Christian Western menstrual taboos, it's not actually that bad. People often think that God cursed Eve, but in fact, the curse is related to the pain of childbirth, not to menstruation. The main mention of menstruation and actually ejaculation of semen has to do with being unclean, with explicit menstrual seclusion practices that may or may not have been out of belief that menstruation is polluting. There is even a story of a woman who many interpret to have been menorrhagic, that means with heavy menstruation, who was healed after touching the hem of Jesus's clothes. So how did we get from sort of ritual uncleanliness to sort of where we are more recently in a lot of Western conceptions of menstruation, which is that it's polluting or dirty. Earlier conceptions of menses in Western contexts were that menses actually helps balance out the humors. And the prevailing thought in both a lot of Western contexts historically, over 1,000 years ago and more, as well as across many cultures across the globe, were that menses was part of the life force that actually made a baby. And so in a lot of ways, there was at least some positive power ascribed to the substance and to the process of menstruation. So somehow in the 12th century, there was, so this is, 1,000 years after the Bible, or so, or at least, that whole Jesus thing. I'm not going to pretend to be someone with a lot of historical or biblical knowledge here. There was a big movement to start to medicalize the body and for people to start to have more rigorous understandings of what's happening inside the body. And so one of the major texts to understand women's health was called De Sacredis Molirum. This was written around the 12th century, but it was used for at least 400 years as a major medical textbook. In fact, it was translated into many other European languages, and it suggests that it was an incredibly popular book, and that people had that people were in high agreement with many of the things that were said about women's health within this book. I think also when you look at that timeline, it's important to note that means that this book was still in major use during a major period of colonial violence. So this is how people thought about women as a lot of this, as colonial violence was happening in other parts of the world. This was also a period of cultural upheaval around gender roles in England and other parts of Europe. And so these upheavals may have contributed to the increasingly negative characterization of menstrual blood as having evil powers. So I'll share with you just a few brief quotes. We've got, woman is not human, but a monster. Menstruating women give off harmful fumes that will, quote, poison the eyes of children lying in their cradles by a glance. Children conceived by menstruating women, quote, tend to have epilepsy and leprosy because menstrual matter is extremely venomous. There's a lot more I could say here about mind-body dualism, and so many other elements of white and Western thought that I think contributed to these separations of maleness and femaleness, and the continued characterization of things that we associate with femaleness as being evil and poisonous and something that we should be controlling. But I think you get my point. This was the thinking around menstruation at the time the colonization was happening all over the world, and reflects intentional subjugation of menstruators and former menstruators. I skipped what this book says about the buildup of poisonous menses in menopausal women, but feel free to Google it. And so therefore there was this view that menstrual effluent is poisonous. It no longer offers sacred creative powers that must be cherished. It no longer balances out the humors even. Those who menstruate deserve to be put in their place, and the best scientific thinking at the time justified it. So if we fast forward to the 20th century, which is when there was a renewed interest in, again, a more scientific perspective of understanding why humans menstruate, we look at we look at the 1920s or so. And for time's sake, I'm going to kind of skip the lore around how this idea came about. But I will say that by far the most popular idea about why we menstruate is that it serves the purpose of removing poisonous substances from the body at this time. This substance was called the menotoxin. And the reason that women menstruate is to cleanse themselves of a toxic substance inherent to their natures. One of the experiments, in fact, involved putting a flower in a vase, just gently in a vase as a control, and then having a menstruating woman, handle the other one, handle the stem of the other, and then put it in a vase, and then of course observe the results. And so of course you can see on the left here, the flower from the menstruating woman has wilted, and the flower that was gently placed in the vase is quite healthy. This idea persisted into the 1970s, and you can actually find references to the menotoxin all the way up through the early 2000s. I want to share with you one quote that particularly chilled me the first time that I read about it in a letter in the Lancet in the 70s. And this letter notes, Dr. Schick, this is one of the founders of the menotoxin, and I discussed the possibility that the adult female diabetic out of control, the depressed adult female psychotic, and the adult female in the premenstrual phase secreted some common substance in their sweat. I just want to draw very directly this equivalence here that's being drawn in this statement, right? That diabetes, that psychoses are equivalent to the premenstrual phase. And now we're seeing there was actually an expansion of the definition of when menotoxin occurred. So it's not just that it's in the menses, right? It's in blood, sweat, milk, and saliva, but it's also not just during the menstrual period, but also in the premenstrual period. At the same time, many scientists were seeking to understand the poison menstruators emitted from their body at the end of each cycle. Others were seeking to understand the mechanistic properties of estrus and menstrual cycling. So we've got the big picture ultimate, why, as well as the proximate how starting to happen around the same time. Much of this work was focused on domesticated animals, which was motivated by efforts to better control and increase reproduction and/or lactation of these animals. While these categories are not perfectly discrete, and that's a whole other talk that's actually super interesting, there are two basic categories of cyclers among mammals, those with induced cycles and those with spontaneous cycles. Induced cyclers are those for whom an external phenomenon triggers ovulation and other components of the cycle. Most often, it's either a physical trigger like vaginal penetration or a chemical one from components of semen. Spontaneous cyclers, like humans, are those who have cycles regardless of an external trigger. Some of the early misunderstandings of spontaneous cycling, even calling them, quote, spontaneous at all, misses a lot of the subtlety of the environmental cues that do play a significant role in influencing the characteristics of the estrus and menstrual cycle. It also keeps the locus of control for reproduction within menstruators. And there are issues here. First, in a patriarchal culture that seeks to place control of reproduction in men, it must be pretty emasculating to see how menstruators, often feminine, are the ones with that power. Second, this particular conception of control over the body often means that menstruators are blamed for irregular cycles, for infertility, and they often internalize any characterization of their cycle as, quote, abnormal, as meaning that the problem resides within them. Part of what is so important in the study of environmental effects on the menstrual cycle is understanding not only that substantial variation is normal and adaptive, but that it has to do with how the body is responding to and protecting itself from stressors. Okay, so menstruation is dirty, and control of menstruation and menstrual cycling resides within women, which is a major threat to male control of reproduction. So were there any responses to these hypotheses for why we menstruate within a Western context? So the first one in 1993 was MacArthur Fellow and physicist Margaret Prophet, who turned this idea of menstrual dirtiness on its head. She argued that menstruation evolved in order to help women expunge the dirtiness of men. So menstruation was a defense against pathogens transported by sperm, as opposed to expelling the inherent dirtiness of the menstruator. As far as I can tell, this hypothesis really pissed people off. The idea that men would be seen as the ones who've got the dirty stuff going on and are giving sexually transmitted infections to women, and that there might be an evolved response in order to protect themselves from it, was something that I think seemed to get people kind of up in arms about. And in fact, there's a lovely series of quarterly review of biology articles that addressed it over the next couple of years. So look, just punchline, no, this hypothesis is probably not supported it's not supported by the literature. And in fact, in a paper just a few years later, Dr. Beverly Strassman, in her own way of addressing the evolution of endometrial cycles and menstruation, does a lovely job explaining why menstruation would not make sense as a defense against sperm-borne pathogens. So, I think it's important to note that no, this hypothesis is probably not correct. And yet, I think the way that it tried to invert this Western concept of polluting menstruation, I think was very powerful. And it was the beginning of a resurgence of attention on, again, the broader potential adaptive value of endometrial cycling and of menstruation. Dr. Strassman herself put forward an incredibly important and provocative hypothesis around energy economy, saying that it is less expensive to menstruate than to maintain the endometrial cycle through a non-conceptive cycle and on to the next one. So maintaining an incredibly differentiated and rich endometrium is just going to be really a lot of work to do. So why not get rid of it and start over? And she sort of indicates through a couple of different lines of evidence the ways in which that might have evolved and some of the energy savings that have come from this type of endometrial cycling. And then again, because like I said, there was this little fight going on in the quarterly review of biology. Colin Finn got into the mix and offered just a few years later another explanation for menstruation. And it is a more of a proximate one, saying that menstruation is a non-adaptive consequence of uterine evolution around the idea of terminal differentiation. So this is sort of getting back at that concept of spontaneous ovulation and spontaneous cycles that I mentioned before. So we spontaneously ovulate, right? And therefore spontaneously produce endometrial tissue in preparation for pregnancy. And so we seem to see menstruation at the most in spontaneous decidualizers, meaning our endometrial tissue doesn't just grow and thicken, it differentiates into something an embryo might like, whether or not an embryo is present, right? That's the difference between the induced cyclers. So we end up with a copious amount of this stuff each menstrual cycle, too much to resorb. And so we get rid of it via the process of menstruation. Terminal differentiation is a wonderful physiological explanation for menstruation. And I think it's one that, that really helps us understand sort of the mechanistic processes that explain why it is that menstruation operates the way it does. The issue that I take is that he separates the process of menstruation from the process of endometrial cycling as though, well, this is just extra blood that just gets expelled, but it itself is not meaningful. So it's a non-adaptive consequence, right? So terminal differentiation is a great physiological explanation. But I think it's important to note that there is a bit of I think this is the place where I worry, where people might take issue with what I have to say here. But I think within anthropology and within the evolutionary sciences, we say a lot about how we don't place value, and it would be a logical fallacy to place value on things if they're adaptive and not put value on things if they're not adaptive. But I find it very curious, the very high quantity of things that happen to occur in more female bodies that end up being characterized as non-adaptive. So, clitorises, female orgasm, menstruation, grandmothering. There was a lot of fights when Kristen Hawk's amazing work came out around post-reproductive lives and grandmothering. And I think it's important to notice that when people try to put forward ideas that highlight the importance of bodies that are often female, that those are times where there is the heaviest criticism. And so we say that we don't necessarily have these logical fallacies and we're so good at being unbiased, but really what I feel like I see, whether or not it appears in the actual pages of publications, but certainly have appeared in my own education and at many conferences, is that there is less value often placed on the lived experience and the physiology of women. And so what was interesting to me as I've been working on my own book about menstruation is that there is actually some newer thinking. Imagine my surprise, in fact, when I started doing research for this book, and I found a more recent group of biologists who had a completely different explanation for the evolution of menstruation, where it actually does have adaptive value. So Jan and Ivo Brozens, Gemma Evans, Lois Salamonson, and others offer a very different way of thinking about menstruation. It's not a byproduct of endometrial cycles. It is actually a necessary and adaptive component of endometrial cycles and fecundity. These are not things that you can separate out. This isn't just blood that just happens to exit through the vaginal canal. This is actually a meaningful and important component that is a requirement of endometrial cycling happening appropriately. So as it turns out, menstrual fluid itself contains all sorts of cytokines and other healing factors that repairs the endometrium as menstruation is happening. So menstrual shedding and endometrial repair actually occur simultaneously, starting at about day 2 of menses. So what happens is, as part of the uterus is shedding, is shedding endometrium, as it's sort of working its way around and shedding, then other parts of it are starting to heal. It's not that like all of it just dumps out at the same time. That's why it takes multiple days. And so there's actually a lot of healing that's happening from the fact that there are all of these factors within menstrual effluent that are staying within the uterus and healing and repairing the endometrium. So it's not just, again, we're not talking about a fluid or an effluent that is simply waste. It's actually an incredibly important component of and necessary to endometrial cycling. So it contains, in fact, menstrual fluid contains inflammatory factors that promote wound healing. So I would not recommend that you take a used menstrual pad and slap it on a wound anytime soon, because there's lots of other stuff in there that could probably actually, that I would not recommend necessarily putting on an open wound. But when looking at the inflammatory factors that promote wound healing, Gemma Evans and others have shown that you actually have better tissue repair occurring when you use the inflammatory factors from menstrual fluid in wound healing contexts in laboratory experiments. Another important way of thinking about menstrual fluid is it also seems to precondition the uterus for trophoblast invasion. And so you might be familiar with preeclampsia, which is a terrible disease of pregnancy that is related to hypertension, and it is a multi-origin disease. So it can happen to you just because you have really crappy luck, and there are a number of other axes by which it can happen. One of the axes seems to be in less exposure to semen. So for instance, there is a higher risk of preeclampsia in folks who've been on hormonal contraception or who have been with their partners for their male partners for a shorter amount of time. And also younger people or first-time pregnant people are more likely to have preeclampsia. And what Brozens and others are starting to argue is it might actually be because that there is a slightly higher risk of this origin of preeclampsia among folks who have where they have had less menstrual practice, where they basically have not had enough times to condition the uterus, and therefore that's going to have a negative impact on the effectiveness of placentation. A more shallow placentation can potentially lead to higher rates of preeclampsia. Some of this, as I've been sort of trying to look a little bit at preeclampsia cross-culturally, it's harder to say whether this bears out across multiple cultures that are not menstruating quite as frequently, say, as in a lot of Western sedentary contexts. But there's some tantalizing evidence out there around age at first birth and preeclampsia, and how there might be a bit of a relationship there. So therefore, menstruation itself seems to be a process crucial to endometrial cycling and cannot really be cast off as a non-adaptive consequence. And yes, that's even if terminal differentiation helps explain mechanistically why it happens. So to my mind, the bang, the hoopah, even early Europeans were not necessarily wrong. Menstruation is crucial to reproduction. It's powerful. And in fact, when we ask the question of why we menstruate, I think it might be more powerful to end on the idea that menstruation is in fact powerful, sacred, and life-giving. So I want to transition here with this idea that when we don't do the work to uncover colonial, white, and/or Western influences on our science, that it can have repercussions for how we actually understand the questions that we're asking. So I want to share a bit about what our lab does and some of the efforts we make to continue to uncover assumptions about how we understand uterine and ovarian function. So it is with a sense of the sacred that the Clancy Lab does what it does. We are an intersectional feminist biology research playground that critically engages with questions around the influence of environmental stressors on the life history and reproductive physiology of women and gender minorities. Our main values are justice and growth. And if you want to learn more about some of the things that we do, please do go to clancylabs.com. It is with, I want to tell 3 short love letters of my lab today. And in fact, it's one of the things that, one of the things I had to do today in order to tell you more about things I'm working on the book is that I had to sort of tell a shorter story about some of the amazing work happening in my lab. So I'm sharing 3 short vignettes, but it means I don't get to talk about everybody. I am giving a talk this Friday at Johns Hopkins that I'm not sure if it's actually open to the public or not. You can certainly find me on Twitter and I will let you know if it is. But in that talk, actually, I will be covering the other half of the lab. So the part where we focus a lot on issues of harassment in the sciences. So just to briefly introduce my lab, Dr. Michelle Rodriguez has recently left the lab. She is now an assistant professor of anthropology at Marquette University, but she was with us for 4 years and does amazing work published with us on both the tent and friend hypothesis. And we also have a paper that was just accepted that looks at sort of internalized experiences of gaslighting among women of color scientists. Dr. Mary Rogers Levan is a postdoc at the Institute for Genomic Biology. I'll be talking about her work quite a bit today. Dr. Katie Lee is a postdoc at Washington University who also has recently graduated our lab. Mary Wilson is a graduate student in the lab. And Dan, Valerie, and Natasha are also amazing collaborators and research assistants who are also honorary lab members. And some of their work I will be discussing today as well. So I'm going to share 3 brief vignettes on menarche, movement, and menstrual puns. So first on menarche. Menarche is one of those phenomena, basically something that Mary Rogers Levan and I have in an upcoming paper, an upcoming chapter actually in a Routledge handbook on anthropology with Cecilia Tamori and Sally Hahn, is that we can contrast the ways in which menstruation has been seen as non-adaptive, as meaningless, as not important, to the ways in which agent menarche has actually been really strongly overvalued. And partly for completely understandable reasons. It's much more visible than other aspects of pubertal timing and tempo. I don't know how many of you remember when adrenarche was for you. You probably don't, because there's no external particular sign of it. You might not remember like when your very first pubic hair arrived or when you were at Tanner stage 2 of thelarchy. These are not things that we have great recollection of. So when we do studies on adults, but we want to understand childhood environment or pubertal transitions, especially among menstruators, agent menarche is often a very powerful thing to study. Unfortunately, it's also deeply pathologized. There is a lot of waiting around of when menarche is going to happen. If it happens too early, well, there's sort of this judgment around what has gone wrong that you are menstruating so early. If it goes late, there's a lot of concern around what's happening to your body that is going late. In fact, there's been research that has asked women, like, when did you get your period? And did you feel like you got your period at the right time? And most women don't feel like they got their period at the right time. They're like, oh, I was early or I was late, even if actually among the averages, they were just totally fine. So even though, and I just wanted to draw attention to a lovely paper by Lauren Houghton and colleagues that looked at pubertal timing and tempo across, again, these other ways of understanding puberty and saw how much variation you can see beyond just looking at menarche. These are, of course, difficult things to study, nearly impossible retroactively. And in fact, in some of our work, we use agent menarche quite often in our research. This is a recent paper of Mary's that looks at the secular trend in agent menarche in rural Poland, where we do a lot of our work. And we've also uncovered, some mild relationships that are interesting. For instance, when we look at, this is one of the samples that we also work with, in addition to working with a rural Polish sample, a Polish American sample, is we've also, for several years, we collected data with a girls' summer science camp. So we were working with a lot of adolescents from sort of age 12 to 18 or so. And we collected a lot of information about their communication styles with their parents, as well as a number of other relevant variables. And one of the things we found is that the communication that they had with their mother was actually, and their fathers, were differently related to their agent menarche. So the better the communication with their mother, the lower the agent menarche, the better communication with their father, the higher the agent menarche. And these are statistically significant, but not super strong relationships. But they did indicate to us that, menarche is, it's a variable that is not capturing the many, many things that are happening leading up to that moment. But it can at least help us look at a couple of different social factors that might produce variation in menarche, and then in turn produce variation in adult functioning. What we found, though, is that across multiple samples in our lab, to what extent does menarche predict what's happening as an adult? We're not actually finding a lot of strong relationships. And in fact, what we're finding is direct relationships between these childhood variables and adult function is actually much stronger. And so in Mary's dissertation, she showed that both on the left, what you're looking at is farming in childhood. So if these kids were, if in this population, they were living in a farm on childhood, during childhood, you can see this is, here's their, if they were not, rather, you can see that their estradiol concentrations are higher than if they were as an adult, right? These are adult hormone concentrations. And then over here, we're looking at adverse childhood experiences. And again, you can see that among folks with few adverse childhood experiences, we see higher estradiol than among those with low to no adverse childhood experiences. So the direct relationships between childhood and adulthood were much stronger than when we thought we might see something through the lens of menarche. So again, menarche is important, but perhaps not as important as we would like for it to be. Next, I want to move on to this question of movement. So there is another assumption that often exists in the literature to some extent, and probably more so in popular lore, that significant physical activity, especially Western styles of episodic exercise, are needed to exert any influence on bone health. So that's why even when we're at home, like we are now, sitting all day long, we're encouraged to get up and move around for some amount of moderate activity every day, right? Like at least 30 minutes a day of moderate activity is needed in order to make sure we're appropriately loading our bones, keeping them strong. Many other things in our body are said to be stronger if we're doing this episodic exercise. There are a lot of populations that don't live that way. And it's curious to focus so much on, say, 30 minutes of one's day and not the other 23 and a half hours, and wonder what's happening there. So Katie actually tests multiple really interesting assumptions in her dissertation that she defended just this year. But I want to focus on just one. And again, it's this idea of the connection between movement and physical activity. So our rural Polish women do not exercise. When we go to Poland, if any of us actually try to go for a run, we are looked at very strangely. That there is not a culture really. I think there is now a yoga studio actually in Limanowa, which is one of the larger towns where we do some of this work. But again, for the most part, the culture is not of exercise because everyone's a farmer. They're working all day. So they don't need to do any more movement. Their leisure time is going to be non-movement activities. Despite the fact that Polish women are not exercising, going for walks, lifting weights, like I got a barbell set up in my gym, in my, in my garage, despite the fact that they don't have any barbells like I do. When we look at their speed of sound measures, so this is an ultrasound measure with a sonometer, looking at both their radius and their tibia, you can see that their tibial score The red line, sorry, reflects the average for white women of European descent according to the manufacturer directions for the sonometer that we use. And then you can see the tibial score is a little above the mean, so tibius, right? So we're looking at lower body loading. And then look at their radius t-score. They blow the curve and are 4 standard deviations above what is expected for white women of European descent. Now, again, they don't have barbells. They're not lifted, they're not doing overhead presses or hang cleans over there. Instead, what is more often happening in this population is that they are lightly active all day. So so a lot of Polish women, even the ones who are not actively participating in farming or the harvest season, are home caring for children. They're washing windows, they're beating rugs, they're churning butter, grinding grains, gardening, caring for animals, chasing after toddlers to keep them from perishing, which seems to be my primary job when my toddler is around. So again, what they're doing are low intensity, but basically all day activities. So what we're looking at here is from a short report of Katie's that was published last year in the American Journal of Human Biology that just shows that basically the majority of the time that this population spends active is largely lightly active time. Right? We don't see, and in fact, when you compare this to our Polish American sample, you see them being basically like sedentary, bout of activity, sedentary, right? And if you look at Polish women in this rural sample, instead we see light activity all the time. And so in fact, the relationship that Katie found in a paper that just came out this year in the American Journal of Human Biology is that the best explanation for why, for radial bone mineral density is habitual use. So this light activity and this domestic labor, which I think is harder to uncover because this is the work of women. Why would we place value on the bone loading of like tending to children or washing windows? But it turns out that a lot of these feminized activities, though they might be lower intensity and take a longer amount of time, are actually incredibly meaningful to bodies and exert significant influence on bone loading. So in fact, some of the life history variables like age at menarche, parity, duration of breastfeeding had no real effect on bone density. It was more overall body size and these habitual use patterns. All right, on to my final love story on menstrual puns. And I say menstrual puns because the name of the project is Morphomenses. One of the things that we have noticed in our lab, and you can see, and I'll tell the story of everybody here in just a moment, but you can see Mary, Katie, Mary, Dan, and Valerie all represented here. And one of the greatest joys that I have had lately actually has been the fact that all of us have been in this amazing collaborative space contributing together to this project in a way that is just one of my happiest time is Friday afternoons when we talk about this project. The way this project came about is that there's a couple of different things that happened. One is we had a former former undergrad who did an honors thesis where we asked her, just because we were like, we really want to know, could you do an honors thesis that looks at the different methods of ovulation detection with hormones and tell us which one you think is the best? So we looked at the mid-cycle drop date and a bunch of other Baird's methods and a bunch of other methods to figure out which is the one that seems to be best at detecting ovulation when you have a whole mess of hormone data for all sorts of individuals. And this is really important in a lot of our work because we need to align our menstrual cycles in order to understand what's happening with these hormones, in order to figure out what's happening with peak estradiol, with mid-luteal progesterone. You know, if you don't line them up appropriately, you can't have a comparative lens between these cycles, or you can't average them among these different groups. So the other major thing that happened at about the same time was that we were going through, and we do mid-cycle drop method. And Katie and Mary, and I believe also Mary, were, had more or less figured out for all of the menstrual cycles across this giant data set we have of Polish and Polish American women, had pretty much been able to calculate, using the typical method where the ovulation date was. But we had a decent handful of participants where we were just like, we don't know how to figure this out. So, if you look at the top left here, this is probably the closest to the classic the classic, like if you look in the textbook perception of what estradiol is doing, right? A nice big peak right before ovulation, and then a little bit more luteal estradiol. But we had ovulatory cycles where the peak was really not that much higher than what's happening in the luteal phase. So that's this lower left. If you look at the top right, we could see women who had multiple high days in a row. And again, still not necessarily any higher than what's happening in the luteal phase. And then we also often had, again, ovulatory women, and many of these were Paris women with proven fertility, where they would have multiple peaks of estradiol. None of this is new. Plenty of other people who study hormones and reproductive ecology have encountered this issue. And as long as we're clear in our methods, we always we sort of explain how we handle these quote unquote weird or strange cycles. But they're really not that weird or strange. We started to really notice that there were a number of patterns that emerged again and again, that we sort of used this single method to align them, that was really helping us see that, this perspective was maybe not the best way to think about even ovulatory cycles in incredibly homogeneous populations. So the question we began to ask was, are there different phenotypes of the menstrual cycle, even among ovulatory, healthy, fertile women, that goes against some of the assumptions we make about what characterizes normal? We've been thinking and talking about this a ton in our lab for years. So we first thought, do we want to do more sophisticated repeated measures analyses, area under the curve measurements? How can we get at shape variation that isn't just about quantity or threshold variation? So Mary Wilson, who's that middle picture there, is the one who first brought to the lab the idea of bringing in her colleague Dan Ehrlich, who's just to her right, in order to do geometric morphometrics on menstrual cycles to start to get at the meaning of these shapes. Geometric morphometrics provides a theoretical and methodological framework that better accounts for this variability. So I first just want to show you two images before I tell you a little bit more about the GM methods. So here is, again, when you average all of our cycles in the Polish and Polish American samples that we have, it looks so much like what you'd see in a textbook. The question is whether that shape actually matches any particular individual, right? Like if you have a bimodal distribution, you can find a mean that doesn't capture any actual human being. And in fact, the ways in which the scale of that mid-cycle peak can sort of be messing with our understanding the full variation. If you actually look at a full scaled version of the menstrual cycle, where you can better see the full variation of every single individual, you can see that this peak is not necessarily quite as meaningful, as is sort of expressed when we look at it in a lot of other contexts. So under geometric morphometrics, size and shape are considered as two separate components that contribute to the overall form of a structure. So using this framework, we can analyze the form of estradiol and how it varies across the entire menstrual cycle. In morphometrics, shape is generally considered to carry a more biologically meaningful signal, while size is driven by environmental factors. The other issue is that GM helps solve is that size discrepancies can obscure shape discrepancies, which is again why there has understandably been such a focus on differences in quantity of hormone. So for time's sake, and so as not to pretend I have more expertise on this than I do, because these are all Dan's analyses, I am skipping a fair bit of methodological detail. After doing a lot of work to determine where the landmarks of the cycle are and how we wanted to scale it. In fact, I'm going to present to you the unscaled version today, but we have 3 different scaling methods that we're playing around with right now. Dan performed a principal components analysis, which we explored with hierarchical clustering. This led to the identification of 6 subgroups within the sample. Again, there's a lot I could say here, or really a lot I could say imperfectly about how we arrived at these 6 groups. But suffice it to say that we had a lot of conversations around the methods and around what was sort of the best fit in terms of what total number of groups best fit the data, and 6 is what we arrived at. I want to show you what these 6 groups look like. So I'm showing you again the analyses where we effectively did not scale estradiol. So the size of that peak is partially driving how these groups were made. Again, we are doing a more scaled version and an intermediate version in some of our analyses to look at this as well. So that means the GM understanding of its shape is still strongly motivated by this mid-cycle peak. But even here, you can see that the mid-cycle peak in estradiol is very variable, even among a homogeneous sample of cisgender white women. So far, we are detecting no major differences in Polish versus Polish American cycles, but we anticipate that population differences might emerge when we start to do this work with progesterone, which I'm sure many of you know is much more variable across populations. Basically just what I want you to notice is that, yes, there are definitely some groups that are probably driven by a very strong mid-cycle peak, but there are others where the mid-cycle peak is actually quite low, but ovulation still occurred. We also have LH data to back up many of these cycles, and also ones where the peak was actually multiple days long before going back down again. So, and then some days, some groups where luteal estradiol is on the higher side, and some groups where it is not. So a lot of different shapes, but all for ovulatory cycles of most of these women are Paris women of proven fertility. So to conclude, feminist biologists test assumptions, which means it's often important to understand the historical and cultural context of a scientific finding. That's how it becomes clearer to us some of the Western conceptions that have influenced the way we understand menstruation, for instance. Menarche may be less meaningful. So, and then in terms of the three vignettes, I just wanted to say that menarche may be less meaningful to understanding adult functioning than other elements of pubertal timing and tempo and childhood environment. Movement that is more commonly practiced by women is still movement and still significantly loads the body. And then finally, menstrual puns, e.g. morphomenses, and that R is because we're doing work in a statistical package within R, can help uncover variation that is erased when there's a focus on hormone thresholds, which you often see in clinical contexts, rather than shapes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kate. Is that your little one? Oh, so sweet.
I shared this particular image. I don't know how much you can see because she's sitting on the toilet and she's very proud because she found one of my pads and opened it up just like she sees me do all the time. So this picture is actually over a year old. She's a full-grown terror toddler now.
Oh, she's very sweet. Thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen, we've got some questions coming in.
Wonderful.
All right. So thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. I'm going to read out some of the questions. So to all of our viewers or listeners on YouTube, if you'd like to ask more questions, you can ask them in the chat box, or you can follow the link to an anonymous Google form, which you'll be able to use to ask questions as well. So our first question is anonymous, and it says, do you think that ideas like the menotoxin have led to the idea today of menstrual blood being dirtier than normal blood?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I think that that's part of it, right? I think menotoxins, or at least we're talking about a similar common ancestor, right? That this idea of menotoxins that emerged in the 20th century comes from these earlier ideas in early Elizabethan England and other spaces where there started to be a bit more of a doubling down around these ideas that menstruation is polluting. Again, more in European, particularly English contexts, not necessarily in a global sense. But there are, I'm not talking about in today's talk, but there are in the book that I'm working on right now, I do talk about the really big literature on menstrual taboos in Western contexts. Just because we don't have seclusion practices doesn't mean that we don't have different ways that we hide menses because of this perception that it's dirtier than menstrual, that it's dirtier than regular blood. We hide it through pads. We can't even advertise pads with red colored liquid, right? It has to be blue. And there's research that's shown that if you become made aware of somebody's menstrual status, that you view them as less competent and you in fact create more physical distance from that person.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Thank you. A second question from Paula Shepherd. Can you talk more about the different directions in effect that you found between girls' relationships with their fathers versus mothers in age at first menstruation? What might explain the different directions?
Yeah, that was a really, we are still, I'll say, I feel like there's a really interesting story we could tell. But I'm not sure that the data are strong enough to support like like an evolutionary adaptive story. But I think if I were, I'll just say, one of the things that we think might be going on is that if you have a stronger relationship with your mother, you might be able to expect more maternal grandmother support, which might lead to your achieving an earlier age at menarche, because you can trust that an earlier age at reproduction could lead to grandmother support. And so there might be sort of an inclusive fitness thing going on there, where if you have a really trusting, great relationship with your mom, then you might be more likely to say, okay, she's definitely going to help me out, so I can definitely move on to this reproduction thing. Whereas if this relationship is stronger with your father, that might not be, the physiological calculus as much.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So you describe yourself as an intersectional feminist biologist, taking that kind of approach to your research, and the same with your lab. Could you perhaps talk to us about why that is such an important position to be taking?
Sure. There's a couple of reasons for it. One is that, there's sort of the obvious, to me at least, sort of moral and ethical reasons that one should prioritize being an intersectional feminist, regardless of whether you think your work is directly connected to that experience or not, because as human beings who train human beings, we are responsible for the training and well-being of many people. And because one of our lab's values is growth, the mentoring of trainees is one of the highest priorities of the lab. So doing a really good job with our people is really important. And intersectional feminism is explicitly intended to recognize the humanity of all people. So that's sort of like the big picture reason. The other reason is that, as I'm sure folks who are more familiar with a lot of these types of theories know, having a sort of single axis perspective on the body as a means of categorizing people or understanding difference misses a lot of really interesting variation. And we anthropologists really like variation. So, to assume that differences are only related to gender or gender identity or race or ethnicity is not capturing adequate variation. And in fact, it's been a really big conversation in our lab lately, both on the more menstrual cycle side of things and the harassment side of things, because of the fact that we're increasingly dissatisfied with work where people have to self-select a particular identity, partly because, as many people know, right, these categories don't actually capture our lived experiences very well. There are people for whom they're going to select white, but white doesn't actually fit the category they belong to, because they might be light-skinned, but be an immigrant from a particular cultural context where whiteness is not a recognized racial category. There are ways in which there are limits on the kinds of gender categories available to people when they're doing this type of research. So we've been playing around more based on what we've been inspired by with the geometric morphometric work, to do more cluster analyses to see what categories hang together, or what groups of people hang together based off of how they answer things, as opposed to like how they answer other types of questions, as opposed to like what they list of the tightly defined categories to which they usually have to answer in a lot of our survey research.
That's so interesting. I also really enjoyed seeing the geometric morphometrics as an option to kind of move into in kind of menstrual research. That's fascinating. We've had some more questions. One from Abby Page. So many birth control products stop menstruation completely for months at a time, or you can skip a period if you desire. Do you think this actually results in poor health outcomes when you're talking about the wound healing properties in menstrual fluids?
That's a lovely question. And I think menstrual suppression is something that, again, I think we have to make sure that we're considering in our cultural context in two ways. One, in that there is such strong pressure in a lot of Western and colonial cultures to hide menstruation, to see it as not valuable, that and to see like gendered female body, typically gendered female or menstrual bodies as less valuable, that there's very high pressure to end menses, to hide menses, to make it invisible, to make the experience of menstruating invisible, which can be very painful for some people, or uncomfortable, or just a non-issue, right, depending on the person. And so, as I'm sure many people know, the experience of hormonal contraception, even with or without this question of menstrual suppression, is actually really variable for people. There is a very strong link between depression and hormonal contraception use, for instance. That's been known for multiple decades, and it's only until they did a double-blind placebo, a double-blind randomized control, whatever they call it, study in more recent years that finally some people started saying, you mean all those other studies of just a couple hundred people that showed this relationship, and all of these anecdotes of women coming to their doctors and saying that they lose their libido, they're incredibly depressed, they're incredibly unhappy on the pill. Like, maybe that's finally real. We're going to finally believe it because of this one particular gold standard way we've decided to evaluate certain types of side effects. So again, the pressure to hide menstruation is so strong that we will ignore the fact that actually more than half of people who use hormonal contraceptive discontinue it. And when you look at if you look at pharmacological studies of it that look at, or pharmacy studies that look at how often do people actually pick up their prescriptions, refill their prescriptions, those numbers of discontinuation might even be higher. So women don't actually, this is a generalization, but there are, what I'll say instead is there are many people who actually do not like how it makes them feel to be on different types of hormonal contraception, including the hormonal IUD. There are also many people for whom it's magic and wonderful and improves their lives immeasurably, right? So this is a heterogeneous population of menstruators that have really variable experiences. So when we ask this question of menstrual suppression and like, is it a good idea or not, or is it something that could be causing harm? I think we have to look at, well, how, what is the mechanism by which it's happening? And what are the pros and cons? Because if a major con in your life would be to get pregnant, then it could very well be that you will overlook, or you will decide that it is more important to use a contraceptive that is imperfect or create some side effects as the only available option, versus not using it, or using a prophylactic method where there might, depending on the situation you're living in, might be dangerous for you or undesirable for you for some reason, right? So instead of sort of like blanket saying menstrual suppressive practices are all good or all bad, or even cause harm or don't cause harm to the body, you have to ask, like, what are the different reasons someone is doing it? If you're a 12-year-old adolescent and you're taking hormonal contraceptives and potentially skipping cycles because your doctor said you need to regulate your cycle, that's a pretty crappy reason. If you are someone who is menorrhagic and experiences incredibly high menses and it's incredibly painful and you lose a ton of blood every cycle, it might be much better to suppress than not. So again, I think the answer lies in recognizing the kinds of cultural harms or the cultural perceptions that might have colored what our available options are, and then asking in that context for that individual what the best option is.
And I guess that's why it's so important that we have choice, that no one's stigmatized to use contraception or use a different type or not use any at all. Awesome, thank you very much. So Rose Stevens says, and she's from the University of Oxford, thank you for an amazing talk. It was really eye-opening to see the 6 shapes of estradiol profiles and to think of them as phenotypes. It seems a lot of research into the effect of the environment on reproductive function and investment uses hormone levels absolutely or relative to other women in the population. If we can't trust hormone levels or peaks, what measures do you think is best to collect if you wanted to actually get a grip on reproductive function variation?
Mm-hmm. That is what we are trying to answer right now. That is such a great question. I don't think that we need to throw out threshold values. We do have evidence that, it's more population level evidence that certain amounts of hormone, like hormone means within certain populations, correspond to, for instance, certain disease outcomes or like higher risk of breast cancer, right? So estrogen exposure as an absolute value or as an estimate based off of what we know of a person's menstrual history, those are still important numbers for sure. And so I hope I didn't overstate the shape thing by saying that those things aren't important. But because we so frequently, especially with estradiol, don't find really big differences between very different populations, we started to wonder, is shape part of what's mattering here? So not just, can we average luteal estradiol and see what differences are there? Can we average periovulatory estradiol and see what's happening there? But is there something about the fact that like somebody with a high periovulatory but low luteal estradiol person might look different or have a different outcome than someone with, say, a high peak, but then like a different luteal estradiol curve as well. So our next steps in that work are actually to start to look at some of these different categories, these different phenotypes, and see the extent to which they correspond or not to a bunch of the other variables we've collected in these populations. So we have energetic expenditure, we have energy intake, we have all sorts of Fitbit measures to look at accelerometers, to look at how many steps people have taken. We have other hormones like cortisol and C-reactive proteins that we can get at potentially psychosocial stressors, inflammatory stressors. We have C-peptide. So it's like, this is going to keep us busy for a really long time as we start to sort of ask this question of, depending on the biological context, depending on the question, is size or shape more important?
Awesome, thank you very much. So Abby Page, who we thought asked the original question on birth control, but actually replaced someone's question by accident, so it was the wrong name, but Abby's actual question is, can the difference of bone loading in density become apparent over short time periods? Specifically, women have high levels of low degree activities if had an office-based job, for example, during maternity leave. So can we see this difference that quickly? She says, this is 100% me, where I have 12,000 steps plus a day during maternity leave, and then the bursts of activity when working, currently watching this on an exercise bike.
Yeah. Oh God, what an interesting question. And actually, later this afternoon, Katie Lee and I, who's now a postdoc at WashU, but is a former trainee of the lab and a collaborator of mine, are meeting to discuss this. Is to explore exactly this question of like how, to some extent, of how are we talking about when we ask this question of habitual use, are we going to see really only population level differences of people who say are like in the rural Polish context, we're talking about people who are farmers their whole lives. They have a different lived experience from me starting from birth, right? As opposed to if we were comparing a population within, say, a United States context, but we were comparing people who started playing sports when they were young versus didn't, or started playing sports as adults versus didn't, right? So looking at changes in physical activity in the short term versus long term is one of the really interesting questions around bone health. Our collaborator, Mariana Kirsch, has looked at childhood effects and found that those are really important even when adult function or adult movement changes. So we do have really great evidence of the long-term stuff. The short term is sort of outside of my wheelhouse and I don't have a great answer yet.
Thank you very much. Okay, so on YouTube, Bethan Swift asks, on the topic of menstruation being adaptive, do you have or know anything about endometriosis from an evolutionary perspective?
Ooh, from an evolutionary perspective, no. It is a stinky condition that I have many people I care about who have it, and it can be pretty awful and frustrating. And I have some collaborations and some attempts to get grant money to look at endometriosis and early lived experience and how it might connect to endometriosis pain, but NIH has not wanted to fund it yet. So we have not been successful at conducting any endo research in our lab. I would not presume to tell an evolutionary story of endometriosis. It is, there are a lot of really interesting ideas out there for how it happens. A huge portion of endometriosis probably is simply retrograde menstruation, right? It's just backflow of menses into the body, where then that endometrial tissue sticks onto somewhere into the abdomen, where it's not normally meant to be, and then responds to hormone as though it's still endometrial lining. But there's also evidence of individuals who don't even have uteruses who have endometriosis. And so there's multiple reasons that the endometriosis seems to arise. So I think, again, for the most part, what we're looking at is actually a pathology as opposed to something I would presume to tell an evolutionary story about.
Awesome. That was a great response. Thank you very much. And so we've got two questions from Hampton Gaddy, who is an undergraduate at Oxford. The first one is, do you think that the work on native feminisms that you were referencing says anything about the long-standing argument in anthropology that patriarchy is essentially common to all human cultures?
Yeah, I mean, without again trying to speak for my colleagues who are Indigenous and for whom they are the ones doing this amazing revitalization work, I would say from my reading of Dr. Rissling-Baldy's books and other books that I can even show you because I literally have been reading this stuff for my book. So it's like literally sitting next to me right now, these amazing books. Apparently I use RX bar wrappers when I'm chained to my desk writing as my placeholders in books. But I would not presume to speak for, as a white person, I would not presume to speak for Indigenous peoples, but my reading of their literature and their amazing scholarship and activism would say that, yes, it is absolutely not some kind of universal that human cultures are patriarchal. There's lots and lots of evidence, not just through Indigenous peoples in North America, but many other parts of the world that indicate egalitarianism. Matriarchal societies are also incredibly common. And so, yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Awesome, thank you very much. The second question from Hampton is, regarding the wound healing point, wouldn't the function just be to heal the uterine lining as the menses sheds?
Yes. I'm not sure if yes. I don't know if I understand the question well enough. I think the thing to me that's so important about what Brosens and Evans and Salamonson and some of these other people have done more recently in this biological context have shown that you cannot separate out, like when we talk about menses, we often use the term menstrual effluent, which effluent means waste, right? So we actually have to stop calling it that, because it's not, I mean, sure, the stuff that's exiting our body eventually, I guess we could see as waste, but while it's still in our uterus, it has a very active effect, like it plays a very active role in endometrial repair and therefore in the endometrial cycle. And so I think part of the ways in which we characterize it as effluent is actually mischaracterizing it because of all of the important work it's doing in the physiology of the endometrial cycle.
Awesome, thank you very much. Hampton, if there is anything that you wanted to clarify, just let us know. Oh, he says thanks, cool, okay. Somebody else says, when is your book expected to come out?
Well, I had wanted to be done with it this year, but between the pandemic and everything else, things have gotten pretty slowed down. I currently have childcare for my youngest. I have two kids, one who's like just down the hall doing her remote learning, and then one who is 3. And the positivity rate where I live, I'm in East Central Illinois, in a very rural part of the country. And we have a university that decided to bring all the students here and put them in a situation where it was inevitable that they would get infected. So more than 11% of our student body is now infected with coronavirus. And our positivity rate is now upwards of 5% in my county, and in my region is now, I think, over 8%. So we are now, I am expecting that the childcare I've been enjoying for the last couple of months is probably, for the safety of my family, going to have to end soon. So all of the work that I'm putting into the book right now is probably going to come to a crashing halt, which means the fantasy I had that my full draft would be done at the end of this year. I mean, I'm on my 3rd revision right now. It's gone for expert review and all that kind of stuff. This is the 3rd round of writing it that I'm working on right now. But I think the fantasy of getting this done before winter break is just that, a fantasy. So my hope is that it will be out by the end of 2021. I think that's reasonable, but it really depends on current events. And I say that, I could have just given a short answer and just said 2021 sometime, but I actually think it's really important to make clear the conditions a lot of us are living in. Even someone like me, who is a privileged person, who has a secure job, who is able to access childcare, at least for some period of time right now, for which I feel incredibly grateful. And yet, there are ways in which my work is going to be slowed down, and things that I really wanted to be out in the world are not going to get out there in a timely manner. So yeah, I think it's just important to notice that those are things that are happening to a lot of parents and caregivers right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that. It actually reminds me of Susana Calvajo, who's one of the academics in the anthropology department who works on primates and has the primate evolution lab. And she really talks to her lab group about the importance of slow scholarship. And, they've been meeting every week and talking about things that they've done during lockdown that's not academic. So they've been sharing things like stuff that they might have baked, or just that they've read a book and something separate. And I think it's really good for people like me who are younger, or like earlier on in our academic career, to hear other academics further along talk about the difficulties of being in academia during a global pandemic. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I think that is it for our questions. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you for coming and for bearing with us whilst we had some technical glitches at the start. For those of you who would like to tune in next week on the 4th of November, we have Professor Daniel Nettle from the University of Newcastle, and he will be talking about seeing people in poverty as rational or perhaps adaptive actors. So do tune in, hopefully same time, 3:30, and there shouldn't be any glitches next time. But Kate, thank you very, very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I've been hoping to get you on this seminar series for a very long time. So that's one good thing that came out of lockdown, is that we could host you on Zoom. So thank you very much. And to everyone else, see you next week.
Thank you.
All right, I think